Live everywhere.
Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, April 28th, 2020. Time for yet another show. How do you like that when I open the show with the, hey, it's just another day, everybody. Let's all jump out of bed and head to the office. Okay, it's been a while, of course. So far, so good, I think. We're hanging in there. At least we're not having a major drop-off in the morning participation from those of you who are regulars, so that's good news, and I imagine that it means that you're in good health. And we should probably do a check-in at some point and check in with, I would hope that those of you who are regular listeners might drop us a line and let us know if you were feeling poorly, and we could all wish you well. But I guess also just be interested in what's going on in your neck of the woods, and are there people that you know who are having difficulty getting through the pandemic, or who have successfully made it through, or perhaps may have had a run-in with the virus, but made it through to the other side, as we say. Just sort of wondering what's happening with people, and, okay, that'll be on everybody's mind. But we are ready to roll with another show, plenty to catch up on today. Today we will be missing Joan McCarter, not because of any illness or coronavirus, not on her part anyway, but a couple of others at the Daily Kos World Headquarters out in wherever the ether it is now, because we all work virtually, and really didn't we always? What has really changed for those of us? All right, I know. Anyway, some much-needed time off, some rest, some vacation schedules, I guess you could call it. No one's going anywhere, obviously, on vacations, but at any rate, the news continues to come, despite the fact that we're supposed to be closed or something like that. And so Joan will be turning her attention there, maybe drop a line here and there, and I can check in on the front page at Daily Kos and or in the queue and see what she's working on, and perhaps we can even work in a sneak preview of something still yet to be published as she watches and keeps an eye on the news for us over on the print side of the print arm of Daily Kos Radio, the little-known blog that is maintained on the internet while we do our thing here. But Daily Kos Radio itself is, of course, live now. I know it, you know it, the American people know it, and one American person in particular, Bill in Portland, Maine, knows it, and he says what we'll do today is that I'll say that my show can maybe kill the coronavirus. Why not? In some respects, sort of like a cleaning. All you have to do is inject me directly into your brain. You can try the lungs if you like, but we're not so sure that the disease resides there anymore. Anyway, but we should look into it, see what happens, perhaps talk to a medical doctor about that at some point. Maybe we could talk to medical doctors about the rest of the things. For instance, the observation made at what's currently the top of the recommended list over at Daily Kos, Aldous Pennyfarthing, who occasionally does, I think, drop in, listen to the show, send us some articles from time to time. Very popular writer, very frequently on the recommended list, asking, shouldn't the media say something when POTUS, that's allegedly Donald Trump, shows up with pupils the size of pie tins? Yeah, they should. But one of many instances in which they just don't say anything about anything. All right, just checking in on the facts and figures in coronavirus world, just to be sure that I'm up to speed on what exactly we're looking at according to the Worldometers. And the figures they've got early in the morning, early going here, so reporting slow to come in. Yesterday, the Sunday-Monday nexus is often kind of slow in their reports from around the United States, really from around the world, as the weekend lag plays itself out. But a few reports this morning of some new cases, and unfortunately new deaths were lingering at just about 57,000, I imagine, probably in the first hours, probably during the first hour of the show, we'll find ourselves ticking over the 57,000 mark. I understand that, oh yes, that's right, Trump did in fact hold a press availability yesterday that was televised, at least in part. I don't know who decided to televise what, but during the show yesterday, Greg mentioned that there was no briefing on the schedule for the day, and it looked like the weekend practice of abandoning these self-harm festivals that Trump likes to hold for 2 hours a day every day were finally going to be put on hold. Someone must have convinced him, probably not using language like you're doing yourself more harm than good, but rather the media hacks, you know how he is. He's stuck in sort of the 1980s model of everything. And at that time, of course, there was no exposure that wasn't good exposure, and you could be ostentatiously, ridiculously showy about your wealth on Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. But there was still, I think, it was still understood the concept of overexposure. And I mean, it may be that we've gotten rid of that in light of our current media landscape. I kind of think maybe the do-it-yourself version of fame, and which appears to be based on videotaping every moment of your life and putting it either on YouTube or on one of the 750 million cable channels that will offer you a reality show deal. I mean, it may be that that's an antiquated thing, but it would be perfectly in keeping with Donald Trump's frozen brain, such as it is, to continue to believe in the concept of media overexposure. And I think they probably could have talked him into it. You know, Cindy Adams would have, called him and told him, hey, I think you're in danger of overexposure. But anyway, it all went out the window, because although he agreed to initially come out in the morning with a schedule that had no televised briefing on it, he did find a way to get himself back on television and talk nonsense. It wasn't a coronavirus task force briefing. They called it something else, and it was populated by another collection of CEOs who, as I understand it, came and basically promised the same thing that they promised a month and a half ago, that they would be giving over some sort of corporate resources to a program of widespread testing, whether it was drive-through stuff again or whatever. I don't even know. Who cares? It was the same announcement that we bought into last time that came to nothing. Now there's a new announcement that will also come to nothing. And I don't know what else to tell you about it. I did see one slide that came out of the presentation was apparently supposed to pass for an 8-step plan for reopening. And it basically steps 1 through 7 were some version of saying, well, we'll reopen. And then step 8 is, profit. We'll all be fine. Everything will be great. I think they threw a couple of buzzwords in there. I think I did see the word galvanize used in there at some point. So, we're going to leverage the synergies across multiple platforms and blah, 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 blah. And then everything will be fine. So anyway. I don't know what else to tell you about it. Let's see. A suggestion here from the mighty OCD. I'm sure you saw this yesterday, but just in case. Well, let's go find out. It's a YouTube video. And it's not clickable. Oh, there's an extra H in your address here. So if I can cut that out. See, now, if I open it on the convenient computer, well, I'll open it up and at least go see what it was. We'll answer the question, did I see this yesterday? That's a great game to play. No, I don't think I did see this one. So, a minute and 27 seconds. What are we looking at here? Scottish government briefing. Is she basically talking about how stupid Donald Trump is with the bleach? I guess that's probably it. Well, we'll pocket that. But we can play that game. Did I see this yesterday or not? And we can probably fill 2 hours easily enough with that. We've got other things to catch up on, though. So before we launch into it, we stand at 56,803 deaths. And during the press thing, whatever it was he decided to call it yesterday, I guess Trump decided to bump his 60,000 figure, looking more and more improbable by the minute, up to 70,000. I don't know exactly what he thought that was supposed to buy him. I believe we'll blow past 70,000 as well. I mean, the big problem as I see it is that we're going to pass 60,000, I imagine, this morning. And no real indication yet that we're on the downside of our curve. We've all been talking about flattening the curve, and I guess not really thinking very much about what the curve meant. We've talked a lot about flattening it, but the curve itself, of course, those of you who took maybe some of the more advanced math or remember some of the more advanced math, not like real advanced math where math geniuses would consider it advanced math. I mean like after adding and subtracting. What else can you do? But remembering perhaps in, I don't know, what would you do this? Like 8, depending on what kind of a math savant you are, somewhere between 8th grade and I guess senior year, somewhere in there, where you would you draw those curves, and then those curves would tell you, give you all sorts of information, but you might remember that it's the area under the curve. You would shade it all in there. You'd plot the curve based on a certain formula or based on the data and make the dots and connect the dots, and it would turn into a curve. And shading underneath the curve, that's the answer for how many people are dying. We've been looking at the curve in terms of how quickly are they dying, how quickly are they being sent to the hospital, how quickly are they getting sick, and do we have enough hospital beds, ventilators, intensive care beds, healthy doctors and nurses, etc., PPE for those doctors and nurses to take care of the people who get sick so that they don't end up under the curve of death there. But we forget that the whole area under the whole curve is what we're going to end up talking about how many people have died from this thing. And if every curve that they've shown, they're not always symmetrical, they're not always bell-shaped curves, to invoke that somewhat. That's a term that has some mixed history, but it just refers to the shape of a regular curve that'll be symmetrical on both sides. And there's no guarantee that this one would be, but generally speaking, we're looking for that shape. And of course, we're not sure yet whether we've peaked or whether we're on the downside of that curve. But even if we are, we're at the very beginning of it. With 60,000 people already under our shaded portion of the curve and the curve not finished, you begin to see what we're facing here. There's a whole downside to this. And even if deaths and illness drops off dramatically, we're still talking about tens of thousands more people. So the idea of it being 60,000 by August is out the window and was out. It was ludicrous when they said it, but they had high hopes. And if you've been doing a lot of the reading of the profiles of what passes for Trump's worm-eaten brain at this point, and the thinking of some of the so-called experts around him, and even some of the actual experts around him, they've been trying to say, well, we want to remain optimistic. I don't know if that was the place to remain optimistic. The metric everyone's keeping the closest eye on, but I guess they thought they would go for a big impact. That's not going to work out. And we have a long way back down on this curve. And, if it is symmetrical, you're looking at another 60,000 on the way down. It may take a full year to get there. And please take your time, by all means. But do remember that, for instance, when Trump referred to the disastrous handling, which it wasn't, of the H1N1 outbreak, and claiming incorrectly that 17,000 people had died when it was really 12,000, overestimating by a significant chunk. Still, that 12,000 those 12,000 were the losses over almost a full year, more than a full year, really, of that pandemic. Apparently the official start and end point, pinned after the fact, of course, to this H1N1 pandemic was about 20 months. So, just 4 months short of 2 years. 12,000 people died in 20 months. Of course, keeping an eye on the numbers, we've had 55,000 deaths in 1 month, which is, as you know, less than 20 months. It is, in fact, 1/20th of 20 months. So before we were talking about 1/10 of the time, we're now looking at 1/20th of the time with 4 times as many people dead. But, it's just like the flu, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone remembers growing up with refrigerated morgues, refrigerator truck mobile morgues parked outside their local hospital or maybe even their local city hall or schools for that matter. Seems very normal. Anyway, so, on the way back down on this curve, we could easily pass that 100,000 mark. And of course, you remember not only was Trump throwing out the 60,000 mark, but he was saying, giving himself an awful lot of wiggle room. Anything under 100,000 is a good job, which of course means that anything over 100,000 is a not good job, which we usually refer to as bad. Of course, 60,000 is bad, 30,000 is bad. Trump would have told you that 12,000 was bad if he knew that that was the real number. But it only applies to other presidents, of course. So anyway, we do have to make our way back down from this curve. And even if there's a significant drop-off, it really looks like we're likely to be flirting with the 100,000 mark. Not that far off in the future. And that's if we're lucky. And remember, this was also with our stay-at-home orders, more or less, across the country in place. Around the world, really. And travel, more or less, curtailed, although we're still flying people around domestically, which will create a problem later as states decide to reopen, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, and by the way, speaking of the stay-at-home orders, apparently, I didn't grab this thing, but I guess we'll look around for it and I'll make a note for it. Tucker Carlson, who inexplicably at some point during the pandemic decided to be, something that would pass for reasonable about things and was actually asking the question, where are these tests we're being promised? There was this moment where it looked like he might break away, but they've recaptured him, and now he's in total flak spin mode. Tucker Carlson has declared that there was no scientific basis ever for stay-at-home orders, and they aren't what has kept illness, infection numbers, and deaths down. It was just the fact that the virus is a lot less dangerous than anybody said it was that has kept those numbers down. And we would have had the same numbers if we had all gone about our business without making any changes. Of course, Greg will tell you tomorrow that it continues to be the case that nobody in America actually believes that. But then again, all it takes is a few at the fringes to ruin things for everybody. I don't think anybody would have said, certainly in the audience, no one I know will drink or inject bleach or any other cleaning product. Although you probably said that with a little bit of hesitancy, saying, I also would have said that nobody would have drank a fish tank or eaten their fish's pills preemptively in order to immunize themselves against the coronavirus, but then people did do it. This is always the answer to everything. In case you're ever wondering, will anybody ever really do this? There are an awful lot of people in the world. Although one of the things you have to keep an eye on is the people that do this, because there's so many people, the chances are that somebody somewhere will do something this ridiculous, but then they die, and then you say, well, okay, that guy's dead now. Now there's no chance that anybody will drink bleach, right? Well, there are a very lot of people in the world, and even when the really foolish ones die in one of these incidents, there's another one to take its place. So anyway, Tucker Carlson says that. We all say Tucker Carlson is out of his mind, but I just bring it up because it's happening. It's happening on television, and we're going to have to deal with it, and there are going to be people who say that. I've noticed, you know how crazy people are out there. When I tweet about the numbers that are being reported and what does this mean, or I discuss what does it mean to have to make our way down from this slope here on our flattened curve, we find that there are people who answer that say, yeah, but the numbers are fake. New York City, I guess one of the other circulating conspiracy theories is, and I don't know, this sounds like one that there might be a germ of truth to somewhere that's being horribly misunderstood and then afterwards willfully misrepresented. But one of the new theories is that the federal government pays hospitals $39,000 every time somebody in their care is found either, I don't know whether the accusation is found diagnosed with COVID-19 or dies of COVID-19. It depends which stupid version of the conspiracy theory you're listening to. And so therefore, New York has been stealing all the monies by pretending that thousands and thousands of people have actually had COVID-19 just so that they could cash in on this crazy program. And I guess this is supposed to distract us maybe from the fact that Ruth's Chris Steakhouse is taking all this money, although they returned theirs, and Shake Shack took all this money and they returned theirs, and now the latest to return their money, the LA Lakers apparently said, oh, we're in financial trouble. They got money, they're returning it. The people who aren't returning it are typically people who own large business concerns who are friends with Donald Trump, who have applied as multiple smaller subdivisions of their larger concern, and they seem to be keeping the money. Anyway, so Tucker Carlson is telling people that sheltering in place and staying at home had nothing to do with it. The rest of the lunatics are saying the numbers are fake, so you can't estimate anything anyway. There aren't 60,000 dead. This is the atmosphere in which we're operating. Anyway, just, thought I'd bring you up to speed on that. Actually, I had another a note about that along the way, and now I forget it. I wrote down about Tucker Carlson and the $39,000 thing I need to search out for you. All right. There was something else I was thinking of that reminded me of, and I said, oh, yeah, I want to get back to that. But these stream of consciousness things, they're difficult to keep track of. Here's what I will do. I will map out the rest of our show. One of the things I want to do, I think I do want to continue with the reading of that excellent read, which we were handed yesterday and over the weekend by Greg from the New Yorker. This was the piece that we got about halfway through yesterday. Seattle's leaders let scientists take the lead. New York's did not, remember? And we learned an awful lot about the, what did they call it? The EIS, the Epidemic Intelligence Service, and how it was formed. How is EIS formed, right? And their history, et cetera, and how its alums are distributed throughout health departments all across the country, and in particular are were on hand in the Seattle, Washington area, and responded appropriately and kept numbers down there. And we were promised a story about how the not the opposite, but how much more difficult it was to get New York's politicians, really, to subsume their role to that of scientists in the face of a pandemic, and what the cost of it eventually turned out to be. And that's on the other side of this piece. I think we got through all of the great stuff about Seattle, and then all of the interesting stuff about the background, the formation of EIS, their experience in the Korean conflict, as we're calling it these days, and back to the old nomenclature of calling it the Korean conflict. And then how their trainees performed domestically in sussing out the source and dangers of lead paint in many of our inner cities, and in particular here in Chicago. And that's kind of where we left off. And then we found out that the big problem was that when we began to outline the form of the new coronavirus pandemic, to no one's surprise, now given the setup of all this, the national politicians, and in particular the White House, had no intention of subsuming themselves and their messaging to scientists and scientific messaging, and we got the exact opposite of everything that was in the field manual for how to deal with these things. And there actually is a manual, and we were told, look, at this point when you're facing pandemic, the scientists have to do the speaking, there has to be a unity of messaging, there has to be a trustable scientific messenger, and the messengers have to walk the talk. And we did the exact opposite. And lo and behold, here we are with 60,000 people dead and looking at another 50 to 60 if we're lucky, even as states now begin to reopen, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, I think maybe the thing I was thinking of was I was wondering, maybe we'll take this one into the break with us before jumping back into the article, since that's happening soon. A lot of people pondering the possibility of one of the states that's reopening experiencing, I think we all probably guessed that this might happen, experiencing a spike in new infections or worse, deaths. And will they have to go back into lockdown again? And I suspect, just guessing, but modeling on other things, public dangers and public health menaces and the way Republicans have dealt with them, my guess is that we might actually be looking at a reopened state experiencing a spike in new infections and deaths and refusing to go back into lockdown, or saying, well, it's too late now, or people aren't going back, or whatever the excuse is that they offer, and simply saying, essentially, we're going to ride it out. We're going to try this herd immunity thing. Science be damned, border states be damned, the fact that there are still domestic flights in and out of this new pandemic hotspot be damned. We don't really care. We just don't have it in us to try and order people back inside. We don't think they'll comply. Maybe that's even correct, but they certainly won't if we're wishy-washy about it. And I think they'll just say, we gave it a shot, it didn't work, and now we're just going to see what happens if we just let people wander around and mingle. And I don't know what recourse other states are going to have, if any, to this. And our hand may once again be forced by the dumbest among us. That worries me. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday, but our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to Patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. All right, welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning show here on Networks Radio. It's a half an hour in. Maybe I'll give you some news or information at this point. It might be useful in our morning. I think I just saw, I'm going to take that as a warning from Mighty OCD that the YouTube that he sent me is NSFR, not safe, I'm gathering, for rodeo, probably, I think is what he's saying, but could be radio. We're apparently, we like to pretend this is going out over the air that's regulated, which is not the case, and I know lots of you would probably like to hear it anyway. Well, we'll see whether we head in that direction. Maybe we'll just risk it all. I think there's no rules at this point. One more observation before we jump into resuming the New Yorker article from yesterday. Let's see what Mike Musson has to say. Since the red states have said that business is more important than lives, they should go all the way and offer corporate sponsorship for coffins, maybe, why not, so that they look like NASCAR waiting to get buried in the ground. And I think a lot of red state denizens might like that a lot. The idea of being buried in a NASCAR-type coffin. Well, I've seen something on TV somewhere along the line about one of the more interesting African nations where fancy decorative coffins are a big deal. Maybe more than one country, but they were only reporting on one of them. I think Conan O'Brien was doing it. Where was he? Does anybody know where it was that he visited? You probably all know. You can let me know. and I'll repeat that country's name, perhaps, if it comes by. Also floated the idea of, or the question of exactly what would we do if one of the states just reopens and it just says, to hell with it. And I think the answer that most people are answering is that is going to happen. They were guessing at which state it was going to be. A lot of people guessing Texas, and probably right. And there's a lot of contenders, though. And I don't know. The answers range everything from nothing to civil war and everything in between. So no one knows the answer to that one. Like I said, I kind of modeled it on, what I modeled it on? I modeled it on armed teachers. I keep thinking back to this story. This, made a big impact on me. The story of the Utah elementary school teacher who accidentally shot herself at school with her concealed weapon. In fact, of course, you may remember it better as the teacher who shot the toilet in the teacher's bathroom and wounded herself. Still, I think, mixed reporting as to whether or not she actually wounded herself with the bullet or a fragment of the bullet, or was wounded by exploding porcelain shrapnel from the toilet. But either way, I'm just thinking of Trump, what you're saying. If there's any way we could inject pieces of toilet through the skin or some other way, so that we could find out, I don't know what exactly he would be experimenting with about that. And his toilet's gold, so he might be thinking about some different kind of treatment. That wouldn't fragment the same way either. Maybe we're all safer with gold toilets. Anyway, this teacher, almost no attention paid to what actually preceded her accident. A little bit of local Utah newspaper reporting. I treasure it deeply when I, being able to recall these facts, that lots of the kids in school reported that despite the supposedly very strict rules and regulations surrounding arming teachers in Utah, or anywhere really, but every time they try to sell this, they say, well, the kids won't be exposed to the gun. And in fact, the rule will be that most states were saying teachers won't be able to discuss whether or not they're armed. We want to keep the element of surprise. It's a very weird mixture of concern for the fragile psyches of school kids crossed with tacticalness that they came up with this idea. And I think largely, by and large, a better policy than, wear the gun strapped to your forehead or your hip, whatever's most convenient. But when they sell this policy of we'll have armed teachers, they try to assuage the doubts and difficulties that people have about this, naturally carrying guns around in classrooms full of squirming kids day after day. You're just waiting for an accident to happen. But people don't understand that in the same way they don't really understand the shaded area under the curve being dead people and how many more are yet to come because of the shapes of curves in general. Same thing. They don't really understand, they conceptualize the armed teachers in the moment they become necessary. At that time that a shooter breaks into the school, even if it doesn't work out, that the teacher is successfully able to defend everybody, at least they have a fighting chance. But they don't consider what happens in all of the time that they spend before someone breaks in and starts shooting, or if someone never breaks in and starts shooting. And instead, you just have a gun and 26 or so squirming students year after year, day in, day out. And when they get too old, you just replace them with 26 other squirmers the next year. And that gun is still there. There's all this time under the curve, if you will, of that gun and the number of hours that gun is spending around squirmy, curious kids that don't know or may not know that the gun is even there, or if they do see it, may not know what the real consequences are of messing with it, etc. Anyway, they sell the policies by saying the teachers are never allowed to tell whether or not they're carrying guns, and they're never, never, never allowed to let the kids in class see them. And then no one ever discusses, well, what happens if that rule is broken? And, of course, we actually have the answer. Many of you who are longtime listeners already know the answer. Those of you who maybe never heard this story, long story short, this particular teacher who happened to have this accident was in violation of this policy regularly. The kids and the parents of the kids in that class said, yeah, sure, everybody knew she had a gun because they could see it sticking out from underneath her sweaters all the time. Sweater would ride up on the side, gun would poke out. Kids didn't think anything of it because out in Utah, where they're all real Americans, everybody is born with a gun in their hand or whatever, and they're not afraid of it. I'll take them at their word on that. But what you can't take them at their word on is the idea that if someone violates the policy, that there will be repercussions. Because if you go to the school board and say, the rule's clear, you're never allowed to let the kids see your gun, or else something. And there's only one something that can happen here of any consequence. I mean, I guess one of the somethings could be, we'll say, you shouldn't do that, you naughty teacher. And then she'll try a lot harder not to let it happen again. And that probably did happen, and it happened again anyway. And they'll say, I told you, you silly teacher. The only real consequence could, of course, be you're violating the policy frequently enough that, or even once, that's frequently enough to tell me that you're not doing what you said you would do. And we are talking about a handheld instant death machine here and 26 squirmers and an endless supply of squirmers year after year. Something's going to happen unless you either get rid of that gun or change your ways entirely, and we don't have any way of actually enforcing the necessity, or impressing the necessity upon you of doing that. And so she kept violating until that thing which those regulations were intended to prevent finally happened. The accident. The reason you're supposed to follow all these rules is to show that you're responsible enough not to have an accident around your squirmers or anywhere for that matter. And nobody cared, and she's got a gun. And I'm sure that if somebody suggested at some point that teacher can't carry anymore, she's not safe, they said, well, would you rather have a mad, crazed gunman break in after we enforce the policy and she's not able to defend your child? And everybody says, well, I don't know. You got me there. Instead of, that doesn't matter to me, the likelihood of my child accidentally being shot before, or, regardless of whether anybody breaks in, or if somebody breaks in, the chances of my child being shot accidentally on her draw. No, we don't talk about those things. Instead, we say, yeah, we can't leave her defenseless, can't do this crazy thing, so we'll let it slide, because the consequences that we imagine for ourselves of doing the thing we said our policy meant is we weren't really serious about that. We just figured no one will ever be so stupid. There aren't enough people in the world to violate this policy on the regular, so let's just do it. And then it turns out there are plenty. And we didn't really think about what we were going to do by way of punishment. Besides which, now in hindsight, we say, hasn't she been punished enough by injecting pieces of toilet through her skin or some other way? And she did, in fact, resign as I don't know what she's doing now. Maybe she's teaching in the next town over. Maybe she never taught again. I don't know. I feel bad about, the loss of that particular employment. Maybe that was the one thing she really loved to do. But apparently the other thing she loved to do was shoot toilets. So, she wouldn't give up on that. And she just had to make a choice eventually. It's one or the other, really. In our school system, I know this seems harsh, but we have exacting standards. Either you teach the kids or you shoot toilets and explode them and inject pieces of porcelain under your skin. We're tough that way. Maybe the next town over won't be so demanding. Good luck to you. Anyway, the point is she violated all the rules all the time, and nobody cared. And nobody could take the gun away. And what will happen with the coronavirus, to bring it back to that other thing that's occupying most of our time, they'll open up and there'll be a spike and everyone will say you should close again. And they'll say, we just really I didn't think it was, we can't, people won't, and the economy, and then we can't contemplate what this really means to clamp down and do what we said we were going to do. So, people, they're going to do their things. And I think that's the model that we'll be following. And if you are unlucky enough to border one of those states that does it, or live in one of those states that does it, yeah, you're just going to have to make your way. And well, there'll be accountability at the ballot box or something. I mean, the game is not balanced. Honestly, look, because how can you offer people balance? Because the only balance is, look, if this state reopens prematurely and deaths spike, and they do the right thing and shut down, doesn't matter. They probably won't, but if they do, right, those people are still dead. And they might not have been had they observed the scientific approach. The game is balanced if you say, all right, you're betting lives, your life is on the line. Governor opens the state, this thing happens, spike in deaths is big enough, provable enough, say, all right, that's it. The only payoff here is we got to kill the governor. Now, we don't do that in this country. We don't even say, though, that their job is on the line. We may vote them out. We're going to vote them out. But on the other hand, what if the other person had an email system that was, we're suspect and we can't possibly, you know how things are. And, our accountability system is not particularly good. But, honestly, there are things that stop short of, we've got to kill the governor here. We should arrest the governor, imprison the governor. Again, something we don't do. But on the other hand, something you might find in China. Maybe that's why their lockdown seems to have been so effective, even though nobody fully believes their numbers. They were able to do a lot. I don't know if that's a great system for us, but I know it's that we play an asymmetrical game here. All right, now before we jump back finally into the New Yorker thing, we'll at least note Kate Sherrill says Ghana is the country with the custom coffins. And I think, that rings a bell. That seems about right. So there you go. Now you have an answer to that question. Now, as we were talking about the EIS, the Epidemic Intelligence, was it service that we came up with? The EIS graduates all over the country. And yet, here when the pandemic actually broke out, the scientists who were supposed to be able to guide everybody through this were told, shut up, get out of the way, or if we keep you around, toe the line. Say the president's right about everything. Yes. Okay, so let's continue on so we can get to the New York part of this. Since then, when they told everybody to shut up, the primary spokesperson during the pandemic has not been a scientist. The farthest thing from it, it is instead Donald Trump, a politician notoriously hostile to science. Further complicating matters, Trump has highlighted a rotating cast of supporting characters, including Pence, then also Dr. Anthony Fauci, of course, from the National Institutes of Health, Dr. Deborah Birx from the State Department, and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, from nowhere. When there are so many different figures, it can cause real confusion about whom to listen to or who's in charge of what. Dr. Tom Inglesby, the director of the Center for Health Security at Johns Hopkins, said, and if the response becomes political, it's a disaster because people won't know if you're making recommendations based on science or politics. And so there's risk that they'll start to tune out. And that's absolutely true. And it's, of course, pretty much what we saw right off the bat. And I guess you'll see it to some extent. I hesitate to both sides it because I don't think they're equivalent, but there are things that happen related to that on both sides. On one side, you'll find Republicans and conservatives and Q conspiracy theorists, etc., who will say the facts and figures that are being offered are just fake, and so we can't trust any of them. And people who refer to actual facts and figures are wrong because they are doing that. Whereas on the other side, you have instead things like, well, I discount what the idiot president said about injecting disinfectant into your lungs because, everything I know tells me that's a bad idea. And I've already concluded a long time ago that this president is too dumb to understand any of the things that he thinks of, any of the things that he says. So I dismiss more or less out of hand whatever it is the president says. The danger of that, of course, is that if the by some miracle, the scientists were to get him back on script and say, listen, you now, they lecture him and he comes to understand, genuinely understand that they really need to be guided by science here. Then when he starts offering up the science, there's going to be some lag time for the rest of us to be able to say, all right, he's talking sense here, and maybe we ought to be listening to him. Despite the fact that he's saying it, we figure he's being handed a script and reading it, but it's, there's the danger that he's talking out of school here again. Although I think just physically you can tell when he's reading scripts versus when he's ad-libbing. It's very easy to see it. He signals it very clearly. So, all right, maybe we would be okay in that instance. I don't know. All right, so already it's clear that some confusion has taken hold. And by the way, I wanted to comment on the idea that there's the risk they'll start to tune out. The risk there being, of course, have we tuned out of Trump's briefings? I have, for the most part. I see the taped highlights after the fact, but it's probably better and healthier for all of us if we do tune out. But then how do we get tuned back in if there's ever good information being offered? All right, already it's clear that some confusion has taken hold. Though the CDC formally recommended in mid-March that Americans practice social distancing, governors in 5 states have refused to order residents to stay home. One of those states, South Dakota, is now contending with a major outbreak. We heard about it in the meat packing context. Federal leaders have given shifting advice. Initially, Americans were told that they did not need to wear masks in public, but on April 3rd, at a White House press briefing, masks were recommended. And this has risked undermining public confidence. Trump announced the change by saying, you don't have to do it. I'm choosing not to do it. Had the CDC been in charge of communicating about masks, the agency surely would have used the change in guidance as a teaching opportunity, explaining that scientists had come to understand that people infected with the coronavirus can be contagious but asymptomatic for longer than originally thought, which means that we need to be more careful when we cough, even if we feel healthy or just have seasonal allergies. Oh, I ran into a lot of that in the early days of the stay-at-home order. I know at least one time I found myself doing the shopping probably early to mid-March at this point, and I don't know whether we were actually at stay-at-home or not, but the supermarkets were beginning to adopt some measures. It must have been after the kids were in. And I found myself in line waiting for the self-checkout, and the employee at the grocery store who was operating, supervising the self-checkout area was there in, rubber gloves, but no mask. And they were diligently cleaning off the touch pads and touch screens of the self-checkout after every customer, which was a good idea, and of course immediately made me say, what am I doing in this line? I should not be in the self-checkout line. But I had like 2 or 3 things. I was making a quick run to fill some gaps. Anyway, she was coughing like crazy. Now, it didn't sound like what we later found out was supposed to be the dry cough that indicated a COVID-19 infection. And she was very quick to point out that, oh yeah, I feel terrible because every time anyone coughs, everybody gets alarmed, but it's just seasonal allergies and I can't help it, which is, was supposed to, I guess, put everybody at ease. And I guess it worked, but it shouldn't have, because there's nothing I've seen anywhere that says you can't be COVID-19 positive and have seasonal allergies. And a cough is a cough, and what's in it is what's in it. And if you're asymptomatic with your COVID-19, but symptomatic with seasonal allergies and cough, everybody you cough on is running the risk of getting infected, no matter what you tell them is really causing your cough. But we didn't know that at the time. And so, that's where the mask thing comes in, I guess. I just sort of wanted to throw that in there. Maybe you had a similar experience. I'm sure that people ran into other people coughing and saying, oh, don't mind me. It's just allergies. Don't worry about it. Except now we know we should have been worried about it. Anyway, there was the president saying, I'm not going to do it. And as we learned about the EIS people, their field manual tells them when you tell people they have to wear masks, you damn well better be wearing masks or they're just not going to believe you. Trump's daily briefings, however, are a chaotic and contradictory affair. Within the span of a few days, Trump threatened, remember this one? I've already forgotten, threatened to quarantine New York City, then reversed himself soon after declaring that he intended to reopen the U.S. economy within 2 weeks. Remember Easter? He called for 30 additional days of social distancing after that debacle. Such inconsistency from a leader is distracting in the best of times. It is dangerous in a pandemic, and dangerous in a pandemic with a moron president, I might add. See how mercurial he was in that. I'm going to quarantine New York City. Not only am I not going to quarantine New York City, I'm going to reopen everything in 2 weeks, whether we're ready or not, because I think it would be beautiful. Right now, everyone is so confused by all the conflicting messages that each time the guidance evolves, fewer and fewer people might follow it. Besser, the former CDC director, said, "We're going backward in our sophistication." Huge problem with this pandemic. Really, this would be a great teaching moment, and we all get a lot smarter every time we're briefed by the scientists or read the articles, and then we end up getting dumber every time the president speaks. Morale at the CDC, as you could probably imagine, has plummeted. For all the responses that I was involved in, there was always this feeling of camaraderie, that you were part of something bigger than yourself, another former high-ranking CDC official told me. Now everyone I talk to is so dispirited. They're working 16-hour days, but they feel ignored. I've never seen so many people so frustrated and upset and sad. We could have saved so many more lives. There were 60,000 plus of them to save out there. And something else we have to dive into one of these days. Lots of writing and analysis now about the surplus, the excess deaths, unexplained above and beyond the normally expected rate of death in any given city at any given time, then plus what's being attributed to COVID-19, and then leaving death rates sometimes 4, 6, 8 times the normal rate unexplained. We were very early in joining in the reading and thinking and analysis of that, originally offered to us by the people at Talking Points memo. And now, once again, 2 weeks later, we find the rest of the mainstream traditional media catching up on that one. So I feel like we prepared you well on that. But that's not what we're talking about right now. We could have saved so many more lives. We have the best public health agency in the world, and we know how to persuade people to do what they need to do. Instead, we're ignoring everything we've learned over the last century. It's 2 things that we've learned over the last century we're throwing out. This one and how to prevent government corruption. All of that's being thrown out. The initial coronavirus outbreaks in New York City, finally, emerged at roughly the same time as those in Seattle, but the city's experiences with the disease have markedly differed. By the second week of April, Washington state had roughly 1 recorded fatality per 14,000 residents. That's an awkward measure, but that's how you get to the 1 anyway. 1 per 14,000. New York's death rate was nearly 6 times higher. There are many explanations for this divergence. New York is denser than Seattle and relies more heavily on public transportation, which forces commuters into close contact. In Seattle, efforts at social distancing may have been aided by local attitudes. Newcomers are warned of the Seattle freeze, which one local columnist compared to the popular girl in high school who always smiles and says hello but doesn't know your name and doesn't care to. I'm not certain I'm clear on what that's supposed to mean, but I get it with respect to the girls in high school, but is a whole town that does that? Whatever. New Yorkers, it says, are in your face whether you like it or not. There's a parenthetical reference here to one of the more humorous warning signs about how to behave in a Bronx bodega, but doesn't add that much to the conversation. New York also has more poverty and inequality than Seattle, and more international travelers. Moreover, as Mike Famulari, I'm guessing, a senior research scientist at the Institute for Disease Modeling, put it to me, there's always some element of good luck and bad luck in a pandemic. Could be just as dumb as luck. It's also true, however, that the city's leaders reacted and communicated very differently at the early stages of the pandemic. Seattle's leaders moved fast to persuade people to stay home and follow scientists' advice. New York leaders, despite having a highly esteemed public health department, moved more slowly, offered more muddied messages, and let politicians' voices dominate. That is the problem, according to this thesis. New York's mayor, Bill de Blasio, has long had a fraught relationship with the city's Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, which, though technically under his control, seeks to function independently, good idea, and avoid political fights. There's always a bit of a split between the political appointees whose jobs are to make the mayor look good and public health professionals who sometimes have to make unpopular recommendations, a former head of the Department of Health told me. But with the de Blasio people, that antagonism is 10 times worse. They are so much more impossible to work with than other administrations. Wow. In 2015, when Legionnaire's disease sickened at least 130 New Yorkers and killed at least 12, tensions between de Blasio and the health department came to a head. After de Blasio ordered health officials to force their way into buildings in the Bronx to test cooling towers for contamination, even though the outbreak's source had already been identified, the officials complained that the mayor was wasting their time in order to brag to reporters that he'd done everything possible to stamp out the disease. Maybe that made him gun-shy with COVID. When the Deputy Commissioner for Environmental Health, Daniel Cass, refused City Hall's demands, one of the city's deputy mayors urged the Commissioner of Health, Mary Bassett, to fire Cass. She ignored the suggestion, but Cass eventually resigned. She later told colleagues that he felt his rebellion had made cooperation with City Hall impossible. Dan Cass is one of the best environmental health experts in the country, Bassett, who now teaches at Harvard, said. New York has one of the best health departments in the country, possibly the world. How do you like that? We'll all be better off if we were listening. We'd all be better off if we were listening really closely to them right now. In early March, as Dow Constantine was asking Microsoft to close its offices and putting scientists in front of news cameras, de Blasio and New York's governor, Andrew Cuomo, who everyone thinks has done such a stellar job here, well, they were giving speeches that de-emphasized the risks of the pandemic, even as the city was announcing its first official cases. We don't have that memory of him there, but I guess this is a good marker for us. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Edwards Radio. All right, hopefully we have the volume of the alarm back down to where it belongs. And let's continue on with this New Yorker piece. Yeah, for all the stellar polling that Andrew Cuomo has, and of course we're reminded along the way by lots of good, the well-intentioned consciences of the left and the Democratic Party as well, the broader left, not necessarily Democratic, etc., but reminding us of some of the other things that Andrew Cuomo has done in the past, or right in the middle of this same pandemic outbreak, there have definitely been some less than progressive reactions and policies implemented by the Cuomo administration. But I guess everybody's got their eye on top-line things like believing scientists, and that's a kind of a low bar to clear. But yeah, as it turns out, in the initial stages, both de Blasio and Cuomo not really all that good in warning people properly, especially considering what actually ended up happening to New York. The hindsight there being 2020, of course, but the fact is, as they report here, that both de Blasio and Cuomo were giving speeches that de-emphasized the risks of the pandemic, even as the city was announcing its first official cases. De Blasio, who did this for much longer, and now we remember, de Blasio initially voiced caution, that's interesting, saying that no one should take the coronavirus situation lightly, but soon told residents to keep helping the city's economy. Go on with your lives and get out on the town despite coronavirus, he tweeted on March 2nd, one day after the first COVID-19 diagnosis in New York. He urged people to see a movie at Lincoln Center. On the day that Seattle schools closed, de Blasio said at a press conference that if you are not sick, if you are not in the vulnerable category, you should be going on about your life. Cuomo, meanwhile, had told reporters that, quote, we should relax. He said that most infected people would recover with few problems, adding, we don't even think it's going to be as bad as it was in other countries. And I'm sure there were a lot of people who might have hoped as much at the time. And I suppose you couldn't be faulted for thinking that privately, but here again, this is what the field manual exists for, and the guidance is good. Don't put the politicians out there giving out feel-good messages and trying to boost confidence if that's not warranted. Let the scientists do the talking, and it won't come out this way. Like I said, it may have been understandable for de Blasio and Cuomo to think that way, or even to think that it might be wise to make people think you think that way, even if you don't. But that's what the manual is there for. Read it and use it, or fail. De Blasio's and Cuomo's instincts are understandable. Look at that. We're on the same page with this. A political leader's job in most situations is to ease citizens' fears and buoy the economy. During a pandemic, however, all those imperatives are reversed. And that's not necessarily something you're going to come to instinctively, and that's why they wrote it down in a manual. But this is the really key part. During a pandemic, all those imperatives are reversed. A politician's job is to inflame our paranoia. Because waiting until we can see the danger, I don't know, only one guy died, right? Call me when it's 50. And then it's too late. Really, by the time you find out about the one, those 50 are on the way out the door. But okay. Waiting until we can see the danger means holding off until it's too late. I think Greg really impressed this on us way early, like a decade ago or more, when he was working on the flu wiki and these things. The city's epidemiologists were horrified by the comforting messages that de Blasio and Cuomo kept giving. Jeffrey Shaman, I don't know how he actually pronounces it, but it's spelled the way it sounds, a disease modeler at Columbia, said, all you had to do was look at the West Coast and you knew it was coming for us. That's why Seattle and San Francisco and Portland were shutting things down. But New York dithered instead of telling people to stay home. By early March, the city's Department of Health had sent the mayor numerous proposals on fighting the virus's spread. Since there weren't enough diagnostic kits to conduct extensive testing, public health officials proposed sentinel surveillance, asking local hospitals to provide the Department of Health with swabs collected from people who had flu-like symptoms and had tested negative for influenza. By testing a selection of those swabs, the department could estimate how rapidly and widely the coronavirus was moving through the city. In previous outbreaks, such studies had been tremendously useful in guiding governmental responses, and this spring, Los Angeles effectively deployed the strategy, as did Santa Clara County in California and the state of Hawaii. In New York City, the health department began collecting swabs, but the initiative met swift resistance. Under federal health laws, such swabs have to be anonymized for patients who haven't consented to a coronavirus test. This meant that even if city officials learned that many people were infected, officials wouldn't be able to identify, let alone warn, any of them. The mayor's office refused to authorize testing the swabs. They didn't want to have to say, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of you who are positive for coronavirus, but we don't know who, right? I wouldn't want to have to say that either. But if the alternative is saying nothing and whatever happens, happens, well, that's a tough choice, but you got to make it. But they didn't. So that was what was behind it. They didn't want to have to say, we know about hundreds, maybe thousands of you who are positive, but we don't know who, according to a Department of Health official who added, it was a real opportunity to communicate to New Yorkers that this is serious. You have to stay home. The effort was blocked over fears it might create a panic. But such alarm might have proved useful. After all, the official told me, panic is a pretty effective thing at getting people to change their behavior. Instead, the problem is it also leads to things like trampling one another in store aisles. So, that's a downside we have to think about as well. After all, though. Panic is pretty effective at getting people to change their behavior sometimes. Instead, the mayor's office informed the health department that the city would sponsor a job fair to find a few new disease detectives. We need them, but job fair. Is that a wise way of doing it? That event was held on March 12th in Long Island City. The Department of Health officials said, we're in the middle of a catastrophe, and their solution is to make us waste time interviewing and onboarding people. The mayor's office eventually relented on the Sentinel surveillance samples, and testing began on March 23rd, almost a month after samples were first collected. By then, the outbreak was well underway, and, well, you know what happened in New York. As New York City's schools, bars, and restaurants remained open, relations between the Department of Health and City Hall devolved. Health supervisors were very, very angry, one official told me. In particular, health officials were furious that de Blasio kept telling New Yorkers to go out and get a test if they suspected they were infected. On March 4th, he tweeted, if you feel flu-like symptoms, fever, cough, shortness of breath, and recently traveled to an area affected by coronavirus, go to your doctor. I'll pause here to say we've learned this much, right? On March 4th, that's probably what most ordinary people thought was the case and probably thought that's a responsible thing to say. The mayor said, you feel flu-like symptoms, talk to your doctor. That's responsible, right? Well, that's maybe the common sense response, but again, the field manual tells you it's not the correct one. I wish somebody had read it or was willing to say, have you, any of you read it? You have? You do the talking then. But no, that's not the way it works with politicians. They never say you do the talking unless they've read the damn thing for themselves, which they just don't. They got to have somebody, I guess, who's read it and who they trust, who can step in and say, don't you do this. Then, okay, where were we? On March 4th, he tweeted, right, about if you feel like you have the flu and you're traveled recently to an affected area, go to your doctor. This was, of course, the opposite of what city health supervisors were advising. People needed to stay inside and call their doctor if they felt sick. Making trips to doctor's offices or emergency rooms only increased the odds that the virus would spread. And the city's limited supply of tests needed to be saved, for that reason, for people with life-threatening conditions. We wish that wasn't the case, but that's where we were at the time. De Blasio's staff, however, had started micromanaging the department's communications, including on Twitter. So even the health department couldn't even speak for itself, right? Finally, on March 15th, the Department of Health was allowed to post a thread. If you are sick, stay home. If you do not feel better in 3 to 4 days, consult with your healthcare provider. Testing should only be used for people who need to be hospitalized. Everyone in New York City should act as if they've been exposed to coronavirus. New Yorkers who are not sick should also stay home as much as possible. One city council member told me that health officials had been trying to say that publicly for weeks, but this mayor refuses to trust the experts. It's mind-boggling. And again, for us, in hindsight, it certainly is. As the city's scientists offered plans for more aggressive action and provided data showing the time was running out, the mayor's staff responded that the health officials were politically naive. At one point, Dr. Marcel Layton, the city's assistant commissioner of communicable diseases, there's a chief commissioner and an assistant, and Layton is an EIS alum, who is revered by health officials across the nation for her inventiveness and dedication. Well, she was ordered to City Hall in case she was needed to help the mayor answer questions from the press, which again might not be initially viewed with the correct amount of suspicion. The mayor's going to have a press conference. We can tell he's going to do that. Mayors have press conferences. The field manual says they shouldn't, but he's going to. And he wants to answer the questions correctly, but he's not a doctor. So what do? We get somebody who knows what they're doing to be there to help make sure that those questions are answered correctly, right? Unfortunately, probably wrong. And indeed, it's described that way here. So here's Layton, summoned to City Hall in case she was needed to help the mayor answer questions from the press. She sat on a bench in a hallway for 3 hours away from her team while politicians spoke to the media. Layton declined interview requests for this piece, by the way. At press conferences, Layton and other physicians played minimal roles, while de Blasio and Cuomo, longtime rivals, each attempted to take center stage. The two men even began publicly feuding, arguing in the press and through aides about who had authority over schools and workplace closures. Eventually, 3 of the top leaders of the city's Department of Health met with de Blasio and demanded that he quickly instate social distancing rules and begin sending clear messages to the public to stay indoors. Layton and a deputy health commissioner, Dr. Dimitri Daskalakis, I'm hoping I got that close to right, indicated to de Blasio's staff that if the mayor didn't act promptly, they would resign. The next day, Layton's staff greeted her with applause, and at least one employee offered to give her some money if she had to make good on the ultimatum. De Blasio was in a corner. He had long positioned himself as a champion of the underclass, and closing schools would disproportionately hurt the poor and vulnerable. We did hear that complaint, and it was true. What's more, unions representing healthcare workers had threatened that nurses, orderlies, and others might stay home unless there was a plan to provide child care. Nevertheless, de Blasio finally acceded to the health officials' demands. On March 16th, after a compromise was reached with the health care unions, city schools were closed, and Cuomo ordered all gyms and similar facilities to shut down. Now, here's a remarkable response to that. Cuomo did that, right? The messaging remained jumbled, however. Right before the gym closure was set to take effect, Cuomo's gym closure, I might add, de Blasio asked his driver to take him to the YMCA in Park Slope near his old home for one final workout. And you wonder whether that's, I just really like to get another workout in and I don't understand the danger, or because Cuomo did it, I'm going to do this, or what. Even de Blasio's allies were outraged. A former advisor tweeted, "The mayor's actions today are inexcusable and reckless." Another former consultant tweeted that the gym visit was pathetic, self-involved, inexcusable. De Blasio and Cuomo kept bickering. On March 17th, de Blasio told residents to be prepared right now for the possibility of a shelter-in-place order. That same day, Cuomo told a reporter, "There's not going to be any you must stay in your house rule." What? Cuomo's staff quietly told reporters that de Blasio was acting psychotic. 3 days later, though, Cuomo announced an executive order putting the state on pause. That's in quotes. He was going to put it on pause, which was essentially indistinguishable from a stay-at-home order issued by cities in Washington State, California, and elsewhere. A spokesperson for de Blasio said that City Hall's messaging changed as the situation and the science changed, and that there was no dithering. A spokesperson for Cuomo said that the governor communicated clearly the seriousness of this pandemic, and that the governor has been laser focused on communicating his actions in a way that doesn't scare people. Just not effective. Anyway, I don't want to both sides it, but that's what the record, as reflected here in this New Yorker piece, seems to be. To a certain extent, de Blasio's and Cuomo's tortured delays make sense. Good politicians should worry about poor children missing school just as much as they worry about the threat of an emerging disease. That's why EIS training is so important. Sonia Rasmussen, a former CDC official, and we heard her tweet storm yesterday, didn't we? That's what she had to say. In a pandemic, the old ways of thinking get flipped around. She added, "You have to make the kinds of choices that, if you aren't trained for them, are really hard to make. And there's no time to learn from your mistakes." And once again, I fall back on the gun model, right? The idea that teachers, even if they go through some specialized training once, twice, once a year even, the idea that they're going to be prepared to shoot at a mass shooter in a classroom full of squirmers, or when they're holding one hostage, or whatever. They get the idea from the movies that they can shoot the bad guy over the shoulder of the hostage, or what have you, right? But the question is, Can they do it effectively? Will they even be able to pull the trigger, even if that's not the situation? It's just a free-for-all, a melee going on in the hallways. Are they going to freeze? Are they going to shoot themselves accidentally when they draw their weapon? And will they be able to pull the trigger if they get a clear shot and absolutely should pull the trigger? Will they be able to do it? This training that police and emergency responders supposedly that they get is supposed to be able to teach them to do that thing which is counter to instinct in so many instances, and to teach them to do it and to do it effectively. And you have a similar situation here. All of the normal common sense possibly sound, things that look like and feel like common sense in the face of a pandemic, all of those things might in fact be the opposite of what you need to do. That's why there's a manual, and even though it feels like it's wrong, just read it. It's right. At least that's what the epidemiologists say, and I guess that'll be our thinking until it fails us one day in the future. Today, New York City has the same social distancing policies and business closure rules as Seattle, but because New York's recommendations came later than Seattle's and because communication was less consistent, it took longer to influence how people behaved. According to data collected by Google from cell phones, another, again, mention of that story that deserves its own session, let's say. According to data collected by Google from cell phones, nearly a quarter of Seattleites were avoiding their workplaces by March 6th. In New York City, another week passed until an equivalent percentage did the same. Tom Frieden, the former CDC director, had estimated that if New York had started implementing stay-at-home orders 10 days earlier than it did, it might have reduced COVID-19 deaths by 50 to 80%. That's a lot of people now. Another former New York City health commissioner told me that de Blasio was just horrible, adding, maybe it was unintentional, maybe it was his arrogance, but if you tell people to stay home and then you go to the gym, you can't really be surprised when people keep going outside. Yeah, right. Again, walk the talk. Did they do it? No. More than 15,000 people in New York are believed to have died from COVID-19. Last week in Washington state, the estimate was fewer than 700 people. New Yorkers now hear constant ambulance sirens, which remind them of the invisible viral threat. Residents are currently staying home even at higher rates than in Seattle. And de Blasio and Cuomo, even as they continue to squabble over, say, who gets to reopen schools, have become more forceful in their warnings. Rasmussen said, "It seems silly, but all these rules and SACOs and telling people again and again to wash their hands, they make a huge difference. That's why we study it and teach it." She continued, "It's really easy, with the best of intentions, to say the wrong thing or send the wrong message. And then more people die." So there you go. That's it. We finished this one up finally, but it makes a very important point that the correct recommended response in the face of a pandemic is very much counterintuitive for our elected leaders. And it's very difficult, and it may just always be impossible to convince them that this is the way politicians have to really respond to pandemics. And it's tough to convince them that who've been handed the legitimacy, some of which sometimes legitimacy they've always sought for their entire lives, to hand that back over. I mean, think about the psychological profile of Donald Trump, who has always been out to, prove that he's anything like his own concept of himself, that he deserves to be in charge and people must listen to them. And it's a huge mistake that the world has gone on for so long without accepting his advice and commentary on everything, right? And he's finally been handed, allegedly, for all intents and purposes, we've acknowledged as a country that the Constitution mandates that we hand all this validity over to him. And how is he going to use it? Is he going to step back, step away from it? Not a guy like him, and probably not very many politicians either. I guess occasionally you find a few that are like that. And maybe it's part of the nature of Seattle now being such a tech hub, and California being such a tech hub, that the politicians, I don't know, I'm theorizing here, but maybe they have a more innate understanding of the esteem in which scientists and tech kingpins, whoever they may be, are held in the West Coast, because so much of the economy revolves around those things, and it's just plain good politics to include them. I mean, I wouldn't say it's great politics necessarily to get out of their way all the time. I mean, for every whatever, who are we talking about as the head of Microsoft that was doing these things? Not Bill Gates, but I forget who it was we were talking about, who's named in the article, the one who actually implemented the order for everybody to start working remotely, right? For every one of those, there's also an Elon Musk, who maybe has no idea what he's talking about. But the fact that he's managed to generate billions of dollars for himself, well, I think that's a good substitute for, in the minds of most of these guys, who will never be handed constitutional mandates to put themselves in a position of leadership. Billions of dollars, I guess, will do the same thing, and substitute in their mind for constitutional legitimacy and whatever. I don't know. But at any rate, look, the response has been different, and it's been rather interesting. That's all I can tell you about this one. All right. I mentioned to you that there was lots of writing now about excess deaths and how to record them. I noticed that there was a New York Times piece on it. There's also now a Washington Post piece on it. Probably a few more outlets. I think the Financial Times did one that was a little more internationally focused. But I'll grab up this Washington Post one because it happens to be conveniently placed in Pocket. And I guess here we'll just say, I think we did a good job picking up on the importance of this story early and discussing it with you. Let's dive into this one here. How long is this one going to take? We'll see. Maybe we'll just skim a bit of it. U.S. deaths soared in early weeks of pandemic, far exceeding the number attributed to COVID-19, says this Washington Post piece. Byline here includes Emma Brown, Andrew Ba Tran, Beth Reinhard, and Monica Umanu. Hope I got those names right. Oh, she's the graphics editor. I haven't heard Monica's name yet, but she's the one responsible for these illustrative graphics that go along this. This is an analysis of federal data, which for the first time estimates excess deaths, the number beyond what would normally be expected during that period. This piece published yesterday, I guess right after the show, 11/11. They waited until we were off the air to put this one out here. And it starts off with this first chart that I guess shows the number of weekly deaths as a seasonal average before the outbreak of the coronavirus here. I guess we're talking about, it doesn't have, there's the timeline, January into February into March. And it wasn't until April that we really started kicking in large numbers of coronavirus attributed deaths. But it looked like the seasonal average number of deaths per week for every reason, flu, heart attack, car accident, bleach drinking absent the bad advice of a president, bleach drinking with the bad advice of a president. Looks like it hovers the seasonal average in January and February, I think because of the flu, hovers at around 57,000 deaths per week and starts curving down as the weather warms up and flu becomes less of a threat, which is why Trump thought that perhaps the coronavirus would be less of a threat. It just turned out not to be the case. And there's plenty of evidence why it wouldn't be like that, but he ignored it all. Anyway, in mid to late March, when we started to see those deaths, the excess deaths skyrocket. And by April 4th, when this chart stops, deaths per week are expected on a seasonal average to have been around, let's say, 53,000 per week. But they were instead 63,000 per week. And we weren't seeing 10,000 people a week at that point, April 4th, die from coronavirus. So the question is, if not coronavirus, what else was killing them? And the answer is, well, it was in fact coronavirus. So we got to find some other explanation. But they said the COVID-19 deaths that were being reported around April 4th would have taken us up to about 56,000 deaths, but we were instead seeing 63. What's responsible for those other deaths? And this was what we were reading about in Talking Points memo, I guess probably like 2 weeks ago now, that the studies in Spain and Italy were showing excess deaths 6 to 8 times what they were expecting seasonally, and now we have info for the U.S. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Networks Radio. Let's see. I think probably the approach we want to take with this is I'll just let you know that there is this reporting, and I think it's an extraordinarily important reporting, but I think we explained the concept well enough, even though we were working with data from Spain and Italy and elsewhere. Now there's data for the U.S., but I think you all get the concept of the excess deaths and what it means. And it's important to know about, and it's important to read, and it's important to read about data from the U.S. And there are a couple of articles about it, and I'll share them with you in the roundup. Maybe we'll discuss them a little bit later. Maybe it's a good thing to discuss with Greg when he's on hand. But I think you need the information, particularly when it's explained with respect to what's going on in the United States, to deal with the occasional lunatic, perhaps member of your family on Facebook or what have you, who will insist, for instance, that the death figures, whether for New York or for the entire country, are just fabrications. I think the lunatic that I happened to run in at random on Twitter was phrasing it in terms of, I was pointing out something that I meant to say yesterday, but confined it to Twitter rather than pointing it out on the radio show. But for whatever reason, I now think I should point it out here. We have this, I think, extraordinary point that can be made in the face of all of these calls for reopening the states and the economy, etc. We are watching these so-called protests. I'm not even certain that they really are just actual protests, but whatever. We have no other name for them at the moment, for reopening the states and the various state capitals outside of the Capitol buildings, the governor's mansions, what have you. And I think they launched, semi-officially on April 15th for whatever reason. And I think it had a lot to do with the fact that it was they were initially reported to have been underwritten by Americans for Prosperity and other Koch-funded, rich people groups, and they usually have tax day protests planned for April 15th, and they love having them. And tax filing day wasn't April 15th this year because of coronavirus, so they had this excess protest capacity and a resentment of what was going on in terms of shutting down the economy, which I guess the excuse was supposed to be they were going to make less money, although apparently there's data out that indicates that that wasn't the case either, that the coronavirus shutdown has somehow magically transformed itself into yet another enormous wealth transfer to the already wealthy in this country at the expense of people who could barely afford anything. Gee whiz, I can't believe that happened. Anyway, so at April 15th was when we started to see these stupid protests we got to reopen the economy. And the fact is, the numbers show this. Because of exponential growth and how numbers work, the vast majority of the already enormous number of deaths that we've seen that are actually attributed officially to COVID-19 have happened very recently. That is to say, through April 14th, before these protests started taking place, the United States had seen about 28,000 people, still a lot, 28,000 people die from COVID-19. In the 2 weeks or so since those protests started, it was like April 15th, 10 days brings us to April 25th, and then another 3 days brings us to the 28th. So not even 2 weeks. And I picked this number up yesterday. So in the 11 to 12 days since the protests started, 30,000 people died from COVID-19. In other words, more people have died from coronavirus since these people started showing up and protesting and saying it's all over, open the state already. We're over the hump here. The curve's been flattened. We're on the downslope. More people have died since the protests started than died before the protests began. Now, somehow that's somewhat of an unfair comparison because of the nature of the slopes of curves and the way they work. And, the area underneath them, as we said, the shaded area underneath it, there's going to be a lot more deaths towards the peak of the curve than there are at the early parts, the opening end here. It's not the tail, but it's, the mirror image of the tail later. But, they don't believe in that anyway, and they don't understand it. But, it's not that the protests themselves killed 30,000 people. The point is that the protests are coming at the absolute wrong time. We're at a period under this curve where each day's death total is going to be enormous. And indeed, it's about 2,000 a day as it runs. Now, we could check now and see whether we've passed our 57,000 mark or whether the delay in reporting keeps us just below. There we are, 56,933. So the reporting is, as we mentioned, slow, although that's more, I think, to do with coming out of a weekend than anything else. But the point is, you can legitimately say right now that at the time these people decided that we were over the hump and we needed to open up because it's been too long already, the vast majority of people who are going to die from this pandemic have not yet died. And they are going to die during the time that they insist that we need to be open. And these guys are going to be eating in restaurants while people are dying by the tens of thousands. And they're going to say, but it hasn't been here yet. And now then we'll experience the spike. And we also discussed what we think people will do about those spikes in those states. They're going to say, well, it's too late now. We're open again and there's nothing you can do. And that's how we'll get to 100,000. And that's how we'll get to 100,000 before hitting the downslope. And that's how we'll end up with 200,000 dead, which would be double the number that Trump pinned the good job figure at. But as you can see, he's got no compunction about bumping the numbers up if he has to. 60,000 is the good job. Now it's 70,000 now that we're approaching the 60,000, and he'll kick it on that much more when it becomes necessary. Let me switch topics because I've got something I want to get to. And it's important, and it's one of 50 billion things that we should be getting to, including new information about possible effects of the coronavirus on very young patients, young kids who were thought to be the most invulnerable in all of this. But as it turns out, there may be hidden effects, and reports coming out of the UK are raising concerns about that. I don't want to panic people, but we'll have to get to that. I'll give you the headline from CNN and then move on to our next subject. Coronavirus could be tied to a rare but serious illness in children, UK doctors say. Reporting this for CNN, Amy Woodyat and Jacqueline Howard, who say a small but rising number of children are becoming ill with a rare syndrome that could be linked to coronavirus. with reported cases showing symptoms of abdominal pain, gastrointestinal symptoms, and cardiac inflammation. UK healthcare bosses and pediatrics specialists have warned. On Sunday, the Pediatric Intensive Care Society in the UK, or PICS, P-I-C-S, tweeted an urgent alert from the National Health Service about a small rise in the number of cases of critically ill children presenting overlapping features of toxic shock syndrome and atypical Kawasaki disease with blood parameters. Does that make sense to any of you? It worries me. Don't know exactly what it means, but I'll go on a little bit here. With some of the children testing positive for COVID-19 as well, the urgent alert sent to UK general practitioners by the NHS warned that over the last 3 weeks, there's been an apparent rise in the number of children of all ages presenting with a multi-system inflammatory state requiring intensive care across London and also in other regions of the UK. The alert added, there is growing concern that COVID-19 related inflammatory syndrome is emerging in children in the UK, or that there may be another as yet unidentified infectious pathogen associated with these cases. So, I don't know how you want to take the fact that it might be something completely different as comfort or, oh no, we have another pandemic. But just another of these weird things. I've also been reading a little bit about how, although it's the most commonly mentioned symptom of COVID-19, fever spike, no more than about 40% or so, if I remember offhand correctly, no more than 40% or so of patients presenting at hospitals and testing positive for COVID-19 actually had a fever or ever develop a fever. Similarly, it's only in about the 30% range that people are developing the respiratory symptoms or the cough or the chills or the body aches, and that there's no symptom among any of them that you can even state definitively a majority of COVID-19 positive patients actually experience. It's this very strange hodgepodge of somewhat linked and somewhat frequently experienced symptoms, but there's just no typical presentation. A lot of things to look at. We even talked about COVID toes being out there, but the cardiac implications, the blood clotting implications. I saw one article that described what was these what they're seeing on scans and x-rays of people's lungs turn out to be a vast mass of microclots. There's something very strange about the way this disease presents, and still something of a mystery. And now we just add this one to it. Again, open the schools because kids don't get it. No, don't do it. I don't think I need to convince anybody here, but I just thought I'd put that one out there. Now I want to switch, though, to a different subject. One of our good online Twitter and podcast listening friends who we know on Twitter as Asparagus Zucchini sent us this thing, which will not only give us about 6.5 minutes to combat the frog in the throat, but bring us back to a very important topic. And it's well, we'll put it this way very quickly, and then I'll add that there's another article that gives some additional credence to it. But it is essentially this, that the economic relief that we've been offered so far by the federal government has been, well, 1, inadequate, and 2, inefficiently distributed, and 3, might never have been up to the task at all. That the fact that so many people are unemployed and may stay unemployed long term, and we may be looking at an awful long lockdown, gives us reason to consider much more than one-time payments and immediate cash relief that are linked to one-time payments, but rather that we ought to be discussing, and this opens the window for discussing, once again, universal basic income. So Asparagus Zucchini, reading one of the early articles pointing this out, I guess early second round. I think a lot of people talked about it, and certainly I saw Asparagus Zucchini. Just basically, he was saying this article tells us that we were right to be considering this many weeks ago when we were first considering how to respond to this. crisis, at least financially. And now we've got this. And while you're listening to his reading of this, keep in mind, I now have, or think about this, I have the Hills article from yesterday, which gives us this hopeful headline: Pelosi, minimum guaranteed income may now be, quote, worthy of attention. So now it's something more than a really good theory that makes a great deal of sense. It is also something, and it takes a lot to take something like this and gain Nancy Pelosi's attention on it. Now, granted, she's given attention eventually also to the Green New Deal, but that she has a very different idea of what that might mean and how to implement it and the timeline on which it would be acceptable to debate and undertake such a thing. Maybe that's the same for UBI, but the fact is she's acknowledged it. That's good. And let's listen to Asparagus Zucchini tell us about why it's important one more time.
This is an article from the Washington Post dated April 10th by Ishan Tharoor. It's called "The Pandemic Strengthens the Case for Universal Basic Income." Just a year ago, the argument for universal basic income, UBI, still seemed like a fringe theory. It was the pet project of a coterie of libertarian academics and some left-wing activists, and the subject of an economic experiment among a small group of people in Finland. The idea that governments should cut a monthly check to every citizen was largely scoffed at by mainstream conservatives, ideologically opposed to handouts, that is, at least average citizens, and rankled left-leaning intellectuals who are wary of diverting resources from already cash-strapped, means-tested programs for the poor. In the United States, Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yang made UBI the cornerstone of his electoral bid, arguing that in an era of technological disruption and increasingly precarious labor markets, governments needed to provide people more of an immediate cushion. Despite a cult following, Yang remained an outlier in the race and suspended his presidential campaign in mid-February. Then came the coronavirus. Pandemic-induced lockdowns and stay-at-home orders have sent economies into free fall. On Wednesday, the World Trade Organization warned that some projections for the ongoing drop in global trade could mean a new Great Depression. More than 17 million Americans have filed jobless claims in the past 4 weeks, a staggering, unprecedented figure. International humanitarian advocacy group Oxfam warned in a new study that the pandemic may force 500 million people around the world into poverty if urgent government action does not alleviate their plight. As governments plot stimulus measures, UBI has become a central part of the discussion. Across the globe, businesses are going to the wall, jobs are being lost, the self-employed are without work, mortgages are being defaulted, savings are being run through, and rent cannot be paid. Noted in an open letter signed by more than 500 academics around the world which called on governments to look beyond traditional welfare policies in this time of crisis. Societies where a large majority of the population works in the informal sector will be hit especially hard. Beyond earnings, there is next to no safety net. This week, Spain's center-left government became the first to unveil plans regarding some form of guaranteed income to a large segment of its population, though details remain unclear, with one report suggesting monthly payments of around $475. Spanish officials believe there's broad legislative consensus behind that effort, and there also appears to be a political will to ensure that payments continue beyond the passing of the pandemic. We're going to do it as soon as possible, Nadia Calvino, Spain's Minister of Economic Affairs, said in a radio interview Sunday, so it can be useful, not just for this extraordinary situation, and that it remains forever. In the United States, elements of Yang's platform have in the space of 2 months gone from being dismissed out of hand in Washington to winning broad bipartisan agreement. At the heart of the $2 trillion stimulus passed by Congress last month was a commitment to cut checks of around $1,200 to Americans below a certain income bracket, though many Democratic critics, including Yang, argue that a one-off payment is insufficient for the crisis. Though a permanent and universal monthly payment is not yet on the table, the political appetite for it may be building. All of a sudden, the cost of UBI isn't nearly as big as a worry as it was even a month ago, Matt Swalinski, director of the Center for Ethics, Economics, and Public Policy at the University of San Diego, told American Public Media's Marketplace radio show. Americans across the political spectrum are calling for the government to spend very large sums of money to keep families on their feet. to keep small businesses afloat and to keep the economy from collapsing. And there is a growing recognition that cash grants do that in a way that provides maximum flexibility in time of drastic uncertainty and rapid change. For Yang, who has given a flurry of interviews over the past few weeks, it's an unfortunate, if not unexpected, reckoning. We are in a generational public health and economic crisis, and universal basic income, or a version of it, is going to become the obvious solution to getting money into the hands of Americans and people around the world, he told Today's Worldview. What seems to some to be marginal or overambitious is going to become common sense pretty quickly. Yang argued that such measures were especially necessary in Washington. The coronavirus is more lethal and devastating to people who have pre-existing conditions and vulnerabilities, he said in a Thursday phone interview. And it turns out that the U.S. had a set of pre-existing conditions that made us more vulnerable: a dysfunctional government, polarized media, inaccessible health care, and pervasive financial insecurity and need. He also insisted that UBI, or at least programs that guarantee income to those in particular need, shouldn't be seen as a panacea, but a baseline government effort that improves Americans' day-to-day lives. In the long run, he believes issues of health care, housing, and climate change will require more sweeping political solutions. Much of Northern Europe has been ahead of the U.S. on providing health care for their citizens, on having a strong, robust safety net, on having people feel if their job is eliminated that they're not going to be left high and dry, he said. We should be moving toward having a much more solid safety net here in the U.S. beyond universal basic income. The pandemic is not a great leveler. What links Yang with the growing body of commentators and politicians elsewhere is a shared understanding that the ravages of the virus have only intensified the pain felt by those already at a disadvantage in societies where inequality is rife. In a widely circulated Wednesday evening segment, BBC presenter Emily Maitlis gestured at the need for some form of UBI or other ambitious social spending amid the pandemic. This is a health issue with huge ramifications for social welfare, and it's a welfare issue with huge ramifications for public health, she said, before asking what kind of social settlement might need to be put in place to stop the inequality before becoming even more stark. Yang's answer, or modified versions of it, could be what many governments elect to pursue. On Thursday, Yang said he doesn't have any regrets about suspending his campaign, but added that certainly it seems that the energy around the ideas of my campaign has just shot up dramatically.
So it would appear. Thanks very much again to Asparagus Zucchini, that crazy name that we'll have to attribute that segment to. But I appreciate having the eye out for this article. And, it fell to the side. It was April 10th piece. And, it's even that was late in coming, but brought back, I hope, presciently, brought back the idea that this is something that ought to be considered. There was another initial burst of interest in it right at the outset when it became clear that we were all going to have to stay home and that possibly everybody would end up losing their jobs and their incomes. But we found out right away, really pretty much, I think, as everybody expected, that Congress was going to be very gun shy about bringing something like UBI up at this point. And of course, the Senate probably would never contemplate it at all. But, there it is. And now we have Pelosi giving it some thought. We might as well see exactly what that's about, anything that the Hill might offer us on this. Christina Marcos wrote this up this yesterday, also right after the show, pretty much 12:36. Minimum guaranteed income may now be worthy of attention, according to Pelosi. Speaker Nancy Pelosi on Monday expressed openness, to a minimum guaranteed income to help keep people hit by the coronavirus shutdowns financially afloat. And I'm sure that at some point this will be given some discussion, hopefully in this article, certainly in the wider debate. Even more to the point, I think, it makes it possible for people to stay home. It should have been the answer from the beginning and should have been anticipated as the answer to, it may be that the protesters who are insisting on opening up the state just simply won't take yes for an answer. There's nothing you can tell them that will satisfy them. And they're going to protest because that's the kind of people they are, and it's political, not practical. But it certainly could help, pull the rug out from underneath the protests if you say, well, you all say you want the economy back open. Let us get back to work. I mean, I guess that's the most persuasive of the arguments they have to offer. None of them are really persuasive, but the one of, I need to provide for my family, and the only way I can do it is to get back out there and work. I mean, it's a dubious argument because people are still going to have to come and patronize your business, whatever it might be. But maybe you can make an argument that will happen. Certainly the idea that, well, I need a haircut is not a great reason to reopen the economy, but people's need to provide for their families. But if you could take that one away by saying, we will provide for your families, and I know it feels weird or bad or whatever, it makes you feel creeped out because socialisms or what have you, tough luck. The point is that UBI or something like it could make it possible for us to say, it doesn't matter what you want about haircuts and whether you want to go bowling and you want to get that tattoo finished. The point is you have to stay home, and now you can without having the one excuse available to you that might actually have some, sympathetic response around the country. You will stay home, and this money will pay for you to do it. Anyway, Pelosi said during an interview on MSNBC that she thinks the financial aid established by the coronavirus relief package enacted into law last month should be extended in some form. I do too, but I bet the Republicans won't. Well, I think we should extend the time. I really do. I always thought that was too short a time. I think we should extend the time, Pelosi told MSNBC's Stephanie Ruhle. Others have suggested a minimum income for a guaranteed income for people. Is that worthy of attention now? Perhaps so, because there are many more people than just in small business and hired by small business, as important as that is to the vitality of our economy, and other people who are not in the public sector to meeting our needs in so many ways that may need some assistance as well, Pelosi said. The law created a small business loan program, of course, known as Paycheck Protection Program, as well as authorizing one-time direct payments to individuals of up to $1,200. Individuals who make up to $75,000 annually are eligible for a $1,200 payment, while those making up to $99,000 can receive a prorated amount. Families are also eligible for an additional $500 per dependent child. The IRS began issuing the payments earlier this month. Maybe. Anyway, lawmakers have been calling for the next coronavirus relief package considered by Congress to extend the direct payments, which some argue should be paid out on a continuous basis until the crisis is over. Senator Josh Hawley, the Republican, the crazy Republican of Missouri, has proposed that the federal government pay 80% of workers' wages up to the national median wage until the crisis ends, similar to what some European governments have been doing to help mitigate the economic damage. Some Democrats, meanwhile, have offered proposals to cover wages or expand individual payments. Representative Pramila Jayapal of Washington has introduced a bill to cover wages for workers earning salaries of up to $100,000 and cover essential business expenses such as rent, while Representatives Tim Ryan of Ohio and Ro Khanna of California, both Democrats, of course, have called for ensuring that adults making less than $130,000 annually would receive at least $2,000 per month. So, it doesn't tell us a great deal, but it tells us that little bit that we needed to hear anyway, that Pelosi has some openness to discussing it and won't be, frightened into shutting down discussion of UBI or something like it, even on a temporary basis, because of socialism fears. And by the way, how have we been doing in the big battle against socialism now that we all have to stand in line outside of our grocery stores for a chance at being able to wander the aisles that have been stripped of toilet paper and meat, and in some cases fresh produce too, as the next shortage appears to be rearing its head in about, well, it was said that it would be about 2 weeks away, and that was about half a week ago. So I guess that leaves us with about a week and a half to get ourselves prepared for that one. That's going to be real interesting, calling for reopening the economy when the economy faces a new crippling blow. We'll see how that goes. Although it is often, it has been reported as well, that a significant portion of the counterintuitive shortages of produce and I guess meats on the shelves has something to do with the restaurants being mostly closed as well and just seeing a dramatic drop in their clientele. And they're not buying from the providers that usually supply them, and that's left them with a surplus that they've ended up having to destroy, which is also an amazing thing. And I understand sort of the logistics of why that might be the case, but I thought President Great Deals would come up with a way to find a method of getting surplus foodstuffs to people who can't find it in the grocery stores or can't afford it elsewhere. But as it turns out, he's incapable of that, just as he's incapable of, well, self-restraint, keeping his hands to himself as tiny as they are, whatever. He's not a very capable guy. But you know what? I can lift your spirits. There is a capable guy coming up next on Netroots Radio who will lift your spirits that way. Justice Putnam and the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy are next with his always interesting mix of news from home and around the world. We'll hear more about it after this.
From Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
How about this? We didn't get to this. McConnell has vowed the next round of coronavirus relief he'd make it impossible for workers to sue their employers if they contract the virus when they're forced back on the job. And by the way, almost no employers are promising any protective equipment or even masks to people who show up to work once their states reopen. Think about that.